Hello, my friends. This is Paul Jansen from United Reformed Church in Somerville, New Jersey, coming to you on the weekend of May 28th, 2023. That means that it is the weekend of Pentecost, 50 days after Easter. So I'm going to read the story of the first Pentecost and then speak about it a bit. I'm not actually present at United Reformed Church this weekend, but I'm able to continue to be with you in this way. So let's begin. When the day of Pentecost had come, they were all together in one place. And suddenly a sound came from the heaven like the rush of a mighty wind, and it filled all the house where they were sitting. And there appeared to them tongues as of fire, distributed and resting on each one of them. And they were all filled with the Holy Spirit and began to speak in other tongues as the Spirit gave them utterance. Now there were dwelling in Jerusalem Jews, devout men from every nation under heaven. And at this sound the multitude came together. And they were bewildered because each one of them heard them speaking in his own language. And they were amazed and wondered, saying, "Are not all these who are speaking Galileans? And how is it that we hear, each of us in his own native language, Parthians and Medes and Elamites and residents of Mesopotamia, Judea and Cappadocia, Pontus and Asia, Phrygia and Pamphylia, Egypt and the parts of Libya belonging to Cyrene, and visitors from Rome, and both Jews and proselytes, Cretans and Arabians. We hear them telling in our own tongues the mighty works of God." And all were amazed and perplexed, saying to one another, "What does this mean?" But others, mocking, said, "They're filled with new wine." Happy Pentecost, people of God. I am not with the church this morning. I'm not actually physically present in church this weekend because back in April, an old college mate of mine, one of my very best friends, decided to, well, as the expression goes, forego further treatment. And I suspect you know what that means. So this morning I am with Gail and her husband Joel and her sisters and children and grandchildren, and I suspect a church full of other friends and strangers in Elkhart, Iowa, and we're having a celebration of Gail's life. Something like a funeral, except the deceased hasn't deceased yet. Gail is in an odd place right now. She's living and dying at the same time. It's a common enough experience. It's happened to all kinds of people. I'm sure you've known folks who've gotten a terminal diagnosis, and so they have one foot still firmly planted on good old terra firma, and the other foot, well, I guess as the expression goes, one foot in the grave. She's neither here nor there. She's both here and there. Time passes differently for Gail now. The light of each day strikes her in a way that it doesn't for the rest of us. Every sound, whether pleasant or grating, has an acuteness to it. Her soul, her soul is stretched thin now, like a veil, translucent, and so that dense barrier in which that most of us recognize, the barrier between heaven and earth, isn't so thick for her. She's in what some folks have called a thin place. Now, usually when folks talk about thin places, they're talking about actual places, locations for which you can identify minutes and seconds and degrees of longitude and latitude. Places like the Isle of Iona, the center of missionary activity in Europe for nearly 400 years, or like St. Peter's Basilica in the Vatican City for many Christians. Thin places, well, of course, they're not restricted to Christianity. The Bangla Sahib Gurdwara in New Delhi is such a place for Sikhs, as is the Blue Mosque in Istanbul for Muslims. You go to one of these places, there's no guarantee you'll have any kind of spiritual high, but it happens to people often enough that they've gotten a reputation for being thin, where heaven touches earth more readily than most other places. The preacher Barbara Brown Taylor writes that what they have in common is their luminosity, the way they light an opening between this world and another, and you're more aware of the thin veil between apparent reality and deeper reality. When you're in a thin place, it works to pull aside the veil for just a moment so you can see through. A thin place is any place that drops you down to where you know you're in the presence of the really real, the most real God, if you must. We really don't know the precise location where the apostles and all those people from hard-to-pronounce places, we don't know exactly where they gathered on the first Pentecost Sunday, but it was most certainly such a thin place. The wind, the tongues of fire, the people speaking languages that didn't belong to them, and people hearing languages that did. All of these were markers that the crowd was really in the presence of the really real, the most real, in the presence of God, whose spirit swirled over the face of the waters in creation, God whose wind pushed back the Red Sea so that God's people could walk through, God whose spirit had blown on the valley of the dry bones and brought them back to life, God whose dove landed on Jesus' shoulder when he was baptized, God whose spirit rolled away the stone and breathed new life back into Jesus. Wherever that mass of people were, God was there. It was a thin place. Heaven touched earth in a special way, and nobody left Jerusalem after Pentecost the same people they were when they came. Well, that happens with Pentecosts and thin places. You get changed, transformed, knocked on your behind, or as Barbara Brown Taylor put it, in a thin place, it's like the floor just dropped you 2 or 3 levels beneath your feet and set you down in a deeper place. Here's an example of a Pentecost that didn't happen on Pentecost Day, but happened on a mountaintop somewhere, as many places, many mountaintops are thin places. A few years ago, Nadia Bolz-Weber, a Lutheran public theologian, went up on retreat. She'd been fasting for a couple days when, as she put it, she felt God's Spirit tell her something. Her mind was busy. Even after 2 full days, she wasn't filled with a warm feeling of goodwill towards humanity or union with the divine. She was filled with regret instead and self-incrimination. She sat on that mountain, perseverating on her mistakes and sins and misdemeanors, sure that those things outweighed everything else about her. All the ill-spoken words and secretly selfish motives, all the friendships lost and betrayals, large and small. And that's when she heard it. That's when she heard it. A voice from God, a voice saying just 11 words about all of that worry and all of that care and all that burden that Weber had brought to the mountain. That's when she heard that voice. But what if you have already been forgiven all of that? But what if you have already been forgiven all of that? All of that stuff you're telling yourself about how awful you are, about how terrible you are. What if you've already been forgiven all of that? She broke down in tears. What if God really loved her? Really loved her? Who would she be, free from all the shame, the self-blaming, from the spiritual cancer that once caused a hymn writer to consider himself an unlovable worm? That was a thin place. A Pentecost place for her. I've been to several thin places myself over the years. Here's one. We We used to own a cottage on a lake in Maine. Now, by and large, it was an expensive and irrational financial move, but there were a few times there, more than a few times, when down at Lakeside, sitting on the dock, 5 a.m. or so, when the world was quiet, the air was cool and still, the waters rippled by just barely over the rocks. Occasionally, every so often, every few days, a loon would pass by. Well, there are words to describe what was happening outside my body, but I still don't have words to describe the sense of wellness, the sense of God's presence that I felt within my body. For a little while, it seemed there was no such thing as time. The light was different. There was just space and communion and being in the presence of the really real. What place is that for you? Where have you experienced the deep wellness of the Holy Spirit washing over you, resuscitating you, lighting you up, giving you a peace beyond peace? Maybe it's happened at United Reformed Church or some other church. Remember, the Sanctuary of United has now seen 130 Pentecosts come and go, and far more than 130 experiences of people experiencing the holy dove of the Spirit landing on their shoulder in one spot or another. It doesn't happen every week to people, probably doesn't happen most weeks, but it happens. It happens. God pulls back the veil and the Spirit whispers God's love into your ears, and all is well, and all is well, and all manner of things shall be well. Even though it doesn't make sense, even though you know things won't be well, but somehow you know they will be. Go figure. And then the service ends and the world becomes, well, the barrier between this world and the next becomes thick again. It gets harder to see God, and the brief, bright hour of fellowship has passed. But you know, friends, a thin place can be anywhere you are, because remember what Jesus said. You know the Spirit, for he dwells with you, and he will be in you. Remember what Jesus said. The Holy Spirit will teach you all things and bring to your remembrance all that I have said to you. Do you get the importance of that? It's not that you have to go to exotic locations or lakesides or church buildings to reach a thin place. Thin places are within you. They're portable. They go with you because the Spirit of God goes with you. Thin places go with you because the Spirit goes with you. The Pentecost was never meant to be something that happened a long time ago in a country far, far away. You know, when we baptize a little one, we say that God promises to send the Holy Spirit daily to renew and cleanse them daily. So on May 28th and 29th and 30th and 31st and June 1 and June 2 and etc., right now, right here, we walk daily into thin places of the mindful heart. Daily we come into the presence of countless bearers of the image of God. As surely as God gives our daily bread, God is everywhere and every when. There is no place, there is no time that can't be thin enough for God to break through. So take that good news with you wherever you go today. Good news that by the power of the Holy Spirit, nothing can separate you. There's no place that can be so thick that you're separated from God's love. The good news. Take with you the good news that nothing can stop the Spirit from blowing you out of the doldrums and into a fair wind and a following sea. Take that good news with you. And you will never be the same. That's the good word for this week. May God be with you in the power of the Holy Spirit, and make Christ present to you each and every day so that you know that you are walking with him every moment. And that makes every moment a thin place of communion with God. Well, that's it. I'll just keep rambling unless I stop sometime here. So God be with you this week and always.